There's the history they tell you, and then there's the history they never wanted you to find. Thousands of years before pyramids reached the sky, before Rome imagined itself eternal, before any map carried borders or flags, there was a place where humanity dared something no one had ever tried. Not just surviving, not just farming, not just building a city, but ruling the world. And the most shocking part? It started with a boy nobody wanted, a child set adrift on a river. A story that sounded impossible, unbelievable, maybe even exaggerated, until the day he changed everything. Today, we go back to the beginning. The moment human history stopped being a collection of scattered tribes and became something organized, powerful, and dangerous. The moment the word empire was born. Welcome to the Saturated Show, where the truth finally gets some color. And welcome to the series, The Empire Timeline, from the first civilization to the last great power. When we talk about the first empire, people imagine armies, kings, gold-covered palaces, and men shouting orders from thrones. But before power arrived in Mesopotamia, life was much simpler and far more dangerous. Imagine a world where every sunrise holds a question, not what job you'll go to, not which city you live in, but whether your home will still exist by nightfall. That was Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization and the arena for humanity's earliest experiments in organization, farming, religion, and war. This wasn't an empty desert waiting to be built upon. It was a region bursting with life, soaked with potential, cracked with tension. Sumer in the south had been the shining jewel of this world for centuries. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Nippur rose from the mud with temples, canals, and markets buzzing with activity. Each city was ruled by its own king. Each king believed he was chosen by the gods, and each priest insisted that their temple sat at the center of the universe. To live in Sumer was to live in a network of pride, competition, and divine ego. Farmers plowed fields in narrow strips of land, divided not only by water canals, but by rivalries older than any of their memories. Soldiers patrolled borders only a few kilometers wide, fighting for territory so small it fit inside a modern neighborhood. Yet every city believed its destiny was grander than the last. But beneath the impressive temples and busy streets, Sumer was slipping into a quiet crisis. Too many people depended on fragile irrigation canals that broke easily. Too many crops failed when one city diverted water away from another. Too many kings wanted more land, more tribute, more respect. And every time conflict erupted, the weakest citizens paid the price. A Sumerian farmer could wake before sunrise to check his barley field, only to find that soldiers from a neighboring city had damaged the canals during the night. His crops would die, his children would go hungry, and when he went to the temple for support, the priest would tell him the gods were displeased. Life became a cycle of work, war, sorrow, and hope that things might improve. While Sumer was struggling to maintain balance, something entirely different was forming in the northern lands. This region didn't have unified cities or a single cultural identity. Instead, it was a mosaic of Sumerians, Akkadians, tribal groups, nomads, settlers, fugitives escaping southern wars, traveling merchants, and dreamers who believed they could build a new life away from the rigid city-states. It wasn't a kingdom. It wasn't a nation. It wasn't even a stable community. It was a living intersection of languages, ambitions, rivalries, and survival instincts. A place where everyone wanted something and no one felt fully at home. A pressure cooker waiting for one spark. The North had fewer temples, fewer laws, and far fewer luxuries, but it had something Sumer had lost: hunger. Not hunger for food, but hunger for opportunity. People here weren't protected by city walls or ancient traditions. They had to adapt, innovate, and take risks to survive. Trade routes cut through this area, carrying metals, wood, textiles, spices, and precious stones. Travelers brought stories of faraway cities, conflicts, inventions, and gods. Ideas moved freely, shaping minds that were far less rigid than the old priestly elites in Sumer. While Sumer held tightly to its traditions, the North experimented with new ways of living. Yet this freedom came with danger. Without established governments, local chiefs fought for influence. Without stable water systems, communities constantly shifted. Without unified protection, caravans were often robbed, and farmers were taxed by groups who claimed authority only through force. Life was uncertain, messy, and exhausting. But this instability created something Sumer could no longer offer: the possibility for someone completely unknown to rise to power. While the southern cities looked inward, worshipping their ancestors and clinging to the past, the north looked outward, waiting, without realizing it, for someone capable of unifying chaos into direction. And history tells us a strange truth. The world's first empire did not rise from the wealthiest city or the most powerful king. It rose from a broken system, a restless population, and a land desperate for a leader who understood both suffering and ambition. Not a prince, not a noble, but a child thrown into a river. Before his rise, before the name Sargon meant anything, the world itself was preparing him. Pressure was building in Mesopotamia. Sumer was cracking under its own pride, and the north was swirling with potential energy, waiting for a single mind to pull it all together. The collapse of the old world was not sudden. It was slow, quiet, invisible to the people living through it. Farmers complained about water shortages. Traders complained about tax. Chiefs complained about influence. Kings complained about loyalty. Everyone felt something was wrong, but no one had a solution. The First Empire did not begin with the sword being drawn. It began with exhaustion. People were tired of small rivalries, tired of weak kings, tired of fighting for land that barely sustained them. They wanted stability, security, and leadership, even if they didn't know it yet. They were ready for a system bigger than their city walls, bigger than their local gods, bigger than their traditions. They were ready for something new. And that is where our story truly begins. Not with war, but with a world that could no longer continue the way it always had. A world searching for direction. A world preparing itself for the man who would change everything. Sargon's brilliance was not only in conquest, but in administration. He understood that armies alone could seize cities, but lasting power required organization. After bringing each city under his control, he established loyal governors, often selecting leaders from local elites willing to swear allegiance to him. Tribute systems were standardized, and resources were redirected to strengthen the central authority. Sargon built roads connecting distant cities, creating a network that allowed rapid movement of troops, messengers, and goods. This infrastructure was revolutionary, transforming a chaotic landscape of competing city-states into a unified, albeit nascent, empire. For the first time, people could imagine that loyalty to a king could stretch beyond their home city. That stability could exist on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet Sargon's empire was not a uniform land of peace. Conflict remained constant, but the nature of warfare had evolved. Battles were carefully planned, often involving psychological strategies as much as physical force. Enemy cities faced sieges that combined direct assault with intimidation, cutting off supplies and creating despair within their walls. Armies were no longer just groups of citizens. They were organized, disciplined, and coordinated under a chain of command that allowed Sargon to project power over greater distances than any ruler before him. The Akkadian army was not merely a tool of destruction. It was the backbone of the empire's stability, enforcing order while demonstrating the consequences of resistance. The human dimension of Sargon's rule was equally striking. Ordinary citizens, who had once suffered under the rivalries of city-states, now experienced a different kind of governance. Trade became safer as caravans traveled under the protection of the empire's authority. Farmers saw their irrigation systems maintained by officials loyal to Sargon rather than rival cities. Temples continued to function, but the narrative shifted subtly. Gods were invoked to legitimize Sargon's rule rather than solely the authority of local kings. Through a combination of mutual respect and improved living conditions, Sargon built not only an empire, but also a sense of identity among people who had previously defined themselves only by their city-state. Religion played a particularly powerful role in this process. Sargon carefully manipulated religious symbols to unify his subjects. He claimed divine favor, presenting himself as a chosen leader who had been guided by the gods to bring order to chaos. While city-states had long claimed local divine approval, Sargon's claim transcended the individual cities, suggesting that a higher cosmic order now endorsed a single ruler. This strategy reinforced his authority, discouraged rebellion, and provided his subjects with a narrative that combined awe, devotion, and inevitability. People could not ignore the message. Sargon's empire was not merely political, it was sanctioned by forces beyond human comprehension. Despite these innovations, Sargon's rule faced constant challenges. Rebellions erupted in cities that chafed under centralized control. Former allies sometimes betrayed him, and distant regions resisted the imposition of governors and tribute systems. Yet Sargon's response was both calculated and ruthless. He demonstrated decisiveness without overextending his forces, using a combination of force, negotiation, and political marriages to secure loyalty. His capacity to balance coercion with cooperation became a hallmark of his leadership and a lesson in the foundations of empire that would influence rulers for millennia. The expansion of Akkad also brought cultural integration. By uniting multiple peoples under one rule, Sargon facilitated the exchange of language, technology, and ideas. Trade networks spread innovations from city to city, including writing systems, agricultural techniques, and administrative methods. The empire became not just a political entity, but a cultural bridge, connecting regions that had previously been isolated or antagonistic. In effect, Sargon created the first framework for a shared human civilization in Mesopotamia, one that balanced diversity with unity, autonomy with central control. At the same time, Sargon's story was intensely human. Historical records, including inscriptions and later accounts, hint at his awareness of mortality, the fragility of power, and the need for vigilance. He understood that an empire could collapse as quickly as it rose if governance faltered, if loyalty wavered, or if famine struck. His ability to anticipate challenges, adapt to circumstances, and maintain control over both people and resources demonstrates a level of political acumen that makes him one of history's most remarkable figures. In essence, Sargon was not just a conqueror, he was an architect of social order, a man who shaped both institutions and human psychology. One of the most enduring aspects of Sargon's rule was the precedent he set. Before him, city-states had dominated the landscape, each functioning independently and often destructively. After him, the concept of an empire, centralized, expansive, and organized, became part of human consciousness. Leaders who came after Sargon drew inspiration from his methods, recognizing that the unification of diverse peoples under a single authority could produce unprecedented stability and prosperity. His achievements were more than military victories. They were lessons in governance, logistics, and the use of ideology to sustain human cooperation at a scale previously unimaginable. Sargon's personal story intertwined with the fate of the empire. From a child set adrift to a ruler who commanded loyalty across hundreds of miles, his life embodied the tension between chance and design, vulnerability and power. The abandonment he suffered as a child may have instilled resilience and determination. The chaos of his early environment may have sharpened his strategic thinking. Every city he conquered, every alliance he forged, and every administrative system he implemented reflected not only the needs of the empire, but also his understanding of human behavior, ambition, and fear. The empire was an extension of him, and he was, in turn, shaped by the people and circumstances that allowed him to rise. As the Akkadian Empire solidified, its influence extended beyond the military and political realms. Art, literature, and architecture flourished under the new centralized authority. Royal inscriptions celebrated Sargon's victories, temples commemorated his divine favor, and stories circulated that blended history with legend, making him larger than life. Ordinary people, while still subject to the demands of empire, gained access to trade, security, and administrative services that had been unavailable under the fragmented city-state system. The empire thus became both a tool of control and a catalyst for cultural development, demonstrating the complexity of early imperial governance. As Sargon aged, the Akkadian Empire reached its greatest heights. Cities from the northern plains to the southern riverbanks acknowledged his authority. Roads connected distant regions, allowing communication, trade, and military mobilization with unprecedented efficiency. The empire's bureaucracy, still rudimentary by modern standards, was sophisticated enough to manage grain distribution, tax collection, and regional governance. Even distant regions, once autonomous and resistant, began to experience the tangible benefits of order. Safer trade, maintained irrigation system, and relative stability that had been absent under the old city-state rivalries. For the first time, large numbers of people could imagine a life less dictated by fear and more by opportunity. Yet, this was also a period of tension and subtle instability. The very mechanisms that sustained the empire could become sources of unrest if neglected or abused. Governors, appointed to enforce Sargon's will, sometimes acted in their own interest, exploiting resources or collecting excessive tribute. Rebellions and uprisings, though suppressed swiftly, were constant reminders that centralized power depended on both loyalty and fear. Sargon understood that maintaining authority required vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to respond to human ambition as deftly as to external threats. Empires, he knew, were living entities, fragile and responsive to the actions of both leaders and citizens. Religion remained central to consolidating power. Sargon claimed the favor of the gods to legitimize his rule, presenting himself as a divinely sanctioned ruler whose authority transcended individual city-states. Temples continued their ritual functions, but now their messages emphasized unity under Akkad and obedience to its ruler. This ideological framework served as both a source of inspiration and a subtle mechanism of control. People accepted, at least partially, the supremacy of the empire because it was presented as aligned with cosmic order, and resistance seemed not only political, but sacrilegious. In this way, Sargon merged practical governance with spiritual authority, reinforcing his rule in multiple dimensions. Sargon's death marked a critical juncture in the life of the empire. Leadership passed to his sons Rimush and then Manishtushu, and eventually to his grandson, Naram-Sin. Each successor faced the dual challenge of preserving what Sargon had built while asserting their own authority. These transitions illustrate the tension inherent in empires, the need for continuity amidst change, the delicate balance between inherited systems and individual ambition. Records suggest that Rimush and Manishtushu were effective, though often harsh, rulers, employing military campaigns to maintain control and suppress dissent. Their reigns reinforced the lesson that sustaining an empire required more than conquest. It demanded ongoing management of human, logistical, and ideological factors. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, represents perhaps the most dramatic moment in Akkadian history. Unlike his predecessors, he declared himself not merely king, but God King, elevating his authority to a divine plane. This audacious claim was unprecedented and provoked both awe and fear among his subjects. He conducted military campaigns against regions that had resisted previous rulers, extending the empire's reach and demonstrating the potential of centralized power. Yet Naram-Sin's ambition also sowed seeds of tension. By positioning himself above traditional divine hierarchy, he challenged religious and political norms, creating friction that would echo in future uprisings. The empire, now at its peak, exemplified both the possibilities and the perils of human ambition. Despite the grandeur of imperial authority, the daily lives of ordinary people continued to define the texture of history. Farmers cultivated the land under the supervision of local administrators, merchants transported goods across newly secure trade routes, and soldiers enforced the rule of law. The empire provided security and structure, but it also demanded obedience and tribute. Families lived with the awareness that failure to comply could bring punishment, yet they also benefited from increased stability and the economic opportunities that came with a larger, organized political system. The Akkadian Empire thus created a dual reality, one of both opportunity and constraint, freedom and subordination. The empire also faced environmental and logistical challenges that foreshadowed its eventual decline. Climatic fluctuations, disruptions in water supply, and overextension of administrative capacity placed stress on the system. While Sargon and his successors had created unprecedented order, human ambition and natural forces tested the limits of centralized control. Rebellions erupted in outlying regions, trade routes occasionally faltered, and famine occasionally struck, reminding rulers and citizens alike that even the most powerful systems are vulnerable to external and internal pressures. These stresses highlighted the complexity of empire, the need to manage not only people but also resources, climate, and unforeseen events. Yet for all its challenges, the Akkadian Empire set a blueprint for what would follow in human history. It demonstrated that centralized authority, combined with military organization, bureaucratic administration, and ideological legitimacy, could unify diverse populations under a single ruler. It showed that human societies could operate on a scale far larger than any city-state, and that ambition, intelligence, and strategy could create structures that outlasted individual lifetimes. The empire's influence persisted in both tangible and cultural ways, shaping subsequent civilizations in Mesopotamia and beyond. Even in its decline, the legacy of Sargon and his descendants endured. Knowledge of governance, military organization, trade networks, and cultural integration survived through subsequent generations, influencing rulers who sought to emulate the success of Akkad. The stories of Sargon, Rimush, Manishtushu, and Naram-Sin became part of the historical record, blending fact and legend. They served as a reminder that the First Empire was not merely a political entity, but a human experiment in organization, power, and ambition, a template for civilizations to come. Even the greatest empires faced the inevitability of decline, and Akkad was no exception. After Naram-Sin's ambitious reign, the empire began to show signs of strain. Overextension, internal dissent, and the limits of centralized administration began to take their toll. Rebellions in distant provinces tested the loyalty of governors, while economic pressures, climate fluctuations, and disrupted irrigation networks threatened the stability of both cities and farmland. Despite the brilliance of Sargon and his successors, it became evident that no human system, however innovative, could control every variable. The empire that had unified Mesopotamia, brought order to chaos, and elevated human organization to unprecedented heights was now vulnerable to forces beyond any king's control. One of the most striking lessons of Akkad's decline is how fragile human systems are in the face of environmental and social pressures. Evidence from ancient records suggests that the region experienced periods of drought that weakened the agricultural base, causing famine and social unrest. Trade routes became unreliable, and cities that had once thrived under centralized governance began to assert their independence. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling. A reminder that empires are living structures, dependent on both natural resources and the cooperation of their people. Even the legacy of Sargon, the man who had turned a river-abandoned child into a ruler of nations, could not prevent the consequences of overreach and environmental stress. Yet, in understanding the fall of Akkad, one discovers the deeper truth about the First Empire. It was never merely about land, armies, or kings. It was an experiment in human ambition, governance, and vision. Sargon's empire demonstrated that people could be united under a single authority, that loyalty and fear could coexist, and that human societies could function on a scale far beyond city walls. It also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in any centralized system, the dependency on resources, the delicate balance of authority, and the need for constant adaptation. Akkad was a mirror of humanity itself, capable of brilliance, innovation, and extraordinary achievement, yet forever subject to the limits imposed by nature and human behavior. The cultural and social impacts of Akkad persisted long after its political decline. Administrative practices, trade networks, and military strategies developed under Sargon and his successors influenced subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Writing systems were refined, record-keeping became more systematic, and the concept of a unified political entity endured as a model for future empires. Beyond the practical, Akkad shaped human imagination, the idea that a single ruler could unify diverse peoples, enforce laws, and inspire loyalty became central to the political consciousness of the region. In this sense, the empire never truly fell. Its lessons were absorbed into the very fabric of civilization. The story of Sargon and Akkad is also profoundly human. It is a tale of resilience, strategy, ambition, and vision, but also of vulnerability, environmental dependence, and the limits of control. Sargon's life illustrates how extraordinary circumstances, combined with intelligence and opportunity, can reshape the course of history. The empire he built was both a product of his genius and a reflection of the collective needs and exhaustion of the people he ruled. It was a delicate balance between authority and pragmatism, fear and respect, individual ambition and societal necessity. The human element, the understanding of psychology, loyalty, and survival, was as critical to Akkad's success as its armies or administrative systems. Today, when historians and archaeologists study Akkad, they see more than ruins and inscriptions. They see the first conscious attempt to create an empire, a blueprint for human organization, governance, and ambition that would echo through the centuries. Sargon's story challenges the assumption that history is simply a sequence of kings and battles. It reveals how individuals, societies, and environmental forces interact to produce outcomes that define civilizations. The boy set adrift on a river became a symbol not only of ambition, but of humanity's capacity to transform chaos into order, to shape institutions, and to leave an enduring mark on the world. The legacy of the First Empire extends beyond Mesopotamia. It informs how we think about governance, leadership, and societal cohesion even today. Empires that followed, from Babylon to Rome, borrowed lessons in administration, military organization, and the use of ideology to unify diverse populations. The Akkadian example illustrates both the potential of centralized authority and the ever-present risk of overreach. It is a testament to human creativity, endurance, and the drive to impose structure on a world that, without vision and courage, might have remained fragmented and chaotic. In reflecting on the rise and fall of Akkad, we also recognize a hidden truth about history itself. It is not merely a record of events, but a story of human choices, ambitions, and limitations. Empires rise not solely because of divine favor or military might, but because people are willing to follow, adapt, and sometimes surrender to an idea larger than themselves. Sargon's life teaches us that leadership is both personal and systemic, that vision requires opportunity, and that the consequences of ambition can ripple far beyond the lifetime of the individual. So as we conclude this first chapter in the story of humanity's empires, consider the human element that underlies every conquest and institution. Consider the farmers whose lives were reshaped, the soldiers who enforced new order, the administrators who maintained the machinery of governance, and the boy who began as abandoned and became legendary. Akkad was the first empire, but it was also the first mirror of humanity's desire for control, unity, and legacy. And the echoes of this experiment continue to shape our understanding of power, society, and ambition even today. If this story of human ingenuity, ambition, and the delicate balance of power moved you even slightly, you're going to want to witness what happens next in history. The world didn't stop at Akkad. Other empires rose, fell, and reshaped civilization, each learning lessons from the first. Hit subscribe and follow along, because this is only the beginning. The history they told you is only part of the truth. The saturated show will reveal the rest, where every empire, every king, and every story shows how humanity learned to rule itself, for better or worse.